I am very pleased today, everybody, to welcome Dr. Federico Lanzarini. He's a professor of international law at the University of Siena. He's the editor of Reparations for Indigenous People, International and Comparative Perspectives, and in the past has served as counsel to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for international negotiations related to cultural heritage. Federico, what a pleasure it is to have you here.
Good morning, Stefan. Good morning, everybody. It's indeed my pleasure being here with you.
Let's start by just giving the audience the bigger picture of the work that you do, what you're most interested in.
Thank you very much. I am a professor of international law with a special focus on human rights at the University of Siena in Italy. My specialization is the rights of indigenous peoples and also the protection of and safeguarding of cultural heritage at the international level. Thanks to this particular interest that I have for indigenous peoples, I have been the opportunity to have several interactions with indigenous communities all around the world. And this has definitely made me a better person because I have discovered their values, their way of understanding life, their spirituality, and it is something that any person in the world should be allowed to enjoy. My university, I am also the delegate of director for students and researchers coming from crisis areas. I have a lot of work to do in this respect because, as you know, unfortunately, there are many crises in the world today, starting with Ukraine and then Palestine, Afghanistan, several African countries. And in most cases, it is a really frustrating activity because we receive daily many messages from young people asking us to literally save their life. And unfortunately, we're only able to help a few of them because we need economic resources and it is not easy to find them. But in the end, each time that we are able to bring a young student in Siena, it is a real success for us.
Mm-hmm. So they're reaching out to you to help them by bringing them to your university?
Yes, exactly. The only thing that we can do is to provide scholarships for them because, as you know very well, the immigration laws of Italy, like most other European and Western countries, are very restrictive. So the only way to legally reach the country is to have the necessary money to stay in the country for a while, for all the necessary time that you need to stay there. And so the only way to bring them to our university is to provide scholarships, which are very expensive. And just to give you an idea, in October, we were able to provide 5 scholarships for students coming from the Gaza Strip. And we had more than 1,100 applications for just 5 scholarships.
Wow. Let's take a step back to what you said at the start here. I know from my own experience in supporting my wife's work on the Garifuna International Indigenous Film Festival, which is designed to help preserve indigenous cultures, that one of the reasons is because of the valuable wisdom that indigenous cultures provide. And so we don't want to lose that, and we want to find ways of disseminating that. And so I'm struck by your first comment about how valuable your contact with these cultures are. Can you say a little bit about, how your life has been enhanced by that, and maybe some specific examples of what you're referring to.
Well, thank you very much for this question. I think that there are many different reasons why the unique cultural identity of indigenous peoples should be preserved. And the first reason, of course, is for indigenous peoples themselves, in order to retain their distinctiveness and cultural identity. And so basically to have the opportunity to live the life they want since several centuries. But at the same time, as I was saying, when you have the opportunity to interact with indigenous communities, you discover a new kind of understanding life and the world, something which is much more spiritual and much less material than what you're used to in your life. And you become yourself a more spiritual person. So personally, in this part of my life, I believe in many more things that I believed before meeting indigenous peoples, because they have shown me that we don't need to find concrete explanation for everything that happens in the world. But sometimes we just need to listen to the wind, to listen to the noise of the waves in the sea, in order to understand something that is very valuable for the life of one person. I have also discovered that the most important thing you have to do when you have this huge opportunity, this wonderful opportunity of interacting with indigenous communities, is to listen, because they, according to my experience, in most cases, members of indigenous communities never say something that does not have an important meaning. When you try to answer to the views and to the arguments with what you're used to according to your Western education, in many cases, then you realize that your arguments can be very silly and not so significant as the ones brought about by members of indigenous communities. So I have learned to listen a lot and not to talk too much when I work with them.
You mentioned more spiritual, less materialistic. And interestingly, I'm about to launch a new podcast called Quantum Leadership, in which we talk about how we can raise the level of leadership to a new level based on quantum principles. And one of those quantum principles, or one way of thinking about the quantum world, is that the material that we're all familiar with, me looking at you, us looking around us and seeing solid items all around us, that when you get down to the smallest atomic level, that all of that breaks down. And some of the physicists say that it breaks down really to information and relationship at the tiniest particle level. Here we're talking about the lessons and the ways that indigenous cultures operate. And I'm thinking that they are more tuned in to community and relationships than the material, which is, again, what we're learning is really what reality is all about on the quantum level. Can you make any comments about that, about the difference in indigenous communities with regard to relationship and community?
Yes, I mean, relationships with everything surrounding community, basically. So please correct me if I'm wrong. I suppose you mean relationships with all elements of life, not only interpersonal relations, but also relations with nature, with relations with the spirits and so on.
Well, I'm referring to both that, but also in terms of relationships amongst each other as well.
Yes, I mean, I can tell you some anecdotes in this respect, because there are some things in life that you understand as a matter of perception, and it is much more difficult to explain them using words. No, so you feel some feelings that pervade all your person, and in some cases it is difficult to give a name to these feelings. No,
Mm-hmm.
but for instance, I can mention what happened to me. It was back into 2010. I was in New Zealand, and I was a guest of some members of the Māori community in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so lucky to participate in a sort of spiritual meeting that they used to have sometimes. And it was particularly interesting because not only members of the Maori people participated in this meeting, but also members of other indigenous communities coming from all around the world. So it was something very special for me. And I remember one night, because basically this spiritual meeting worked uh, like this. They gather for 3 or 4 hours discussing about any kind of topic. And then they had more hours of reflection, of lonely reflection during the day or during the night, in order to develop in their mind the elements that they had known during the conversation. So, for instance, it was in that occasion that I knew an indigenous leader from Alaska, and then we became friends with each other. So later, he was my guest in my country, and I was his guest in Alaska. And we were discussing about a very simple question, apparently. What is the meaning of indigenous peoples? And he did not say many things, but next morning at breakfast, he approached me and gave me a little piece of paper and told me, I have not been sleeping last night because I had to think about your question. What does indigenous peoples mean? And he had written a couple of sentences in this piece of paper that were particularly meaningful and gave a wonderful explanation of the concept, if can be defined as a concept, that sometimes it is not equally effective when you read articles that take 30 or 40 pages in order to explain that. So it was something very simple, but at the same time very elaborate spiritually. And in 2 sentences, you had everything you needed in order to understand what is the meaning of indigenous people. And after a couple of years, as I told you, I was in Alaska with him, and I had another wonderful opportunity to participate in the traditional fishing of the salmon fish. And by the way, it is a very unacceptable situation, at least from my point of view, because you saw so many fishermen coming from Europe who had the opportunity to fish all the time, everywhere. And indigenous communities, on the contrary, they were allowed to fish only one day during the year for
Wow.
each different species of salmon. So basically, there are 5 species of salmon, and they had the opportunity to fish only for 5 days.
Wow.
While tourists did not have any kind of limit to their activity. And this is really unacceptable if you think that all the land belonged to the indigenous communities, no, before the coming of the Europeans.
Yeah, I would have thought it would be the opposite.
Yes, exactly. And so, on the one hand, they were trying to catch as much fish as possible, but on the other hand, I was really impressed by the way they were treating the fish during the activity.
What do you mean?
I mean respect. I mean awareness that they were taking something from nature for which they had to give thanks. I mean appreciation of the opportunity, even though, of course, they were disadvantaged in comparison to people who were totally extraneous to that land.
Federico, I'm curious about the note that the indigenous person from Alaska shared with you, the 2 sentences that he shared. Can you share that with us right now?
Yes, what this friend of mine from Alaska wrote in this little piece of paper is the following. What is the definition of indigenous peoples? Something is indigenous when it is naturally growing in an area. For people, they are indigenous if they are from an area and they live there in harmony with their surroundings. There is synchronization between the people and their place. They go together in unison. There is an alignment, a correct positioning with respect to each other, so they perform properly. The frequencies of the heart and the people are in resonance with each other.
That's beautiful. And very,
Yes,
very succinct.
I guess so. In my opinion, it's really beautiful.
Well, it's one of the things that's very interesting about that, Federico. I do a lot of work in the area of resilience. And one of the reasons why in our society people are less and less resilient is because we are out of harmony with the environment in many different ways. But one way is that while we still carry the stress response, the survival response, the threat response of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, so our survival mechanism adapted to a hunter-gatherer environment. Our environment has evolved exponentially since then, but our biology has not equally shifted. So we have a biology that fits a very different environment that we live in. And here you're talking about indigenous who are in such harmony with their environment.
Yes, I think this is the point. There is a basic difference between us as Western people, and of course, I'm referring to myself basically, and to the people who live close to me, and indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples normally feel that they belong to nature, they belong to the environment. So they are a part of the environment who must act exactly in harmony with all other components. Our idea, on the contrary, is that we dominate the world and the environment is something that we should exploit.
Right.
And I mean, this, I'm sorry about saying that, but this risk to lead us to destruction, because you know that this year the War Overshoot Day fell a few days ago in May, which is terrible because it means that for more than half of the year we had to use resources produced by the world many years ago. But these resources are not endless.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a kind of approach which cannot last for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also, when we talk about sustainability, and you know that there are the Sustainable Development Goals developed by the United Nations in the Agenda 2030, and now we are very close to 2030, and the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, are very far from being reached. And you know, we have the recipe. We should simply observe how indigenous peoples live and manage their relationship with nature. The problem is that first, the international community, or most of the international community, is not willing to give up certain prerogatives of life that are commonly believed as determining the well-being of people, which are prerogatives that are not coherent with the idea of sustainable development.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, when the international community, also at the legal level, deals with indigenous peoples, normally, even though the approach, fortunately, in the last few decades has changed, but I think that there is still in many people this creeping idea according to which indigenous peoples are underdeveloped communities that need to be brought to the same level of development of the dominant society. So, for instance, in the Sustainable Development Goals, the only mentions of indigenous peoples are in the sense that indigenous communities are poor, underdeveloped, and they should be allowed to reach the same level of development of the Western people. And in no part of the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets, there is a reference to indigenous peoples as those people who could learn the international community how to live in harmony with nature and to give proper realization to the idea of sustainable development. And personally, it's hard to understand this particular approach because it is an approach which does not promise to lead us to any positive outcome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And so as we're saying this, it highlights the importance of learning the lessons of and the wisdom of indigenous cultures and how they live in harmony with each other as well as with their environment and surroundings. And so I appreciate all your efforts to help achieve this and get the word out.
Well, you're very good with me in this moment, but unfortunately, I mean, I do not think that I may be able to do really much for indigenous peoples. Basically, what I had learned is that the only role that could be played by practitioners, academics, and any kind of person working in the field is just to try to create the conditions for indigenous peoples to live the way they want to live, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I have to teach anything to members of indigenous communities. So the only thing that we can do, still in my opinion, is to try to create the conditions for building a bridge between the indigenous world and the world of the dominant society.
Mhm.
in order to make the dominant society receptive of the indigenous values, and especially to understand what one should really do in order to allow indigenous peoples to live their life the way they want to live.
Mhm. And you wrote on the culturalization of human rights laws, where you assess how ideas of multiculturalism have shaped the development of modern international human rights laws. Is your concept of multiculturalism part of that effort, or to expose more people to the notion of multiculturalism?
Yes, of course. And again, when I decided to write that book, I was very much inspired by my experience with indigenous peoples, because I have noted that there is, again, especially in the area of the world where I live, there is an approach to human rights which sometimes represents a real paradox, because we tend to conceive human rights in an excessively individualistic manner, so that the realization of our personal rights in too many occasions results in the exclusion of the others.
Mm.
So, in some way, we are creating a sort of competition
Mm.
between the rights of different persons.
Mm. That's such a
And
very good point.
no, it is something that I am progressively maturing also on the basis of very simple experiences, but it happens so many times that people use the expression, this is my right. And when you say, but don't you think about what may happen to another person in consequence of the exercise of your right?
Mm-hmm.
And the usual response is, this is not my problem.
Mm-hmm.
So we are losing the idea of the community and the idea
Mm-hmm.
of solidarity.
Right. Mm.
This is the reason why I like, in terms of philosophy of human rights, I like much more the African or the Latin American system than the European system, because the relevant monitoring bodies have been able to shape human rights in order to make them really effective for all the different communities living in the areas of the world. And this is exactly what I refer to with the word culturalization. I mean, the idea of human rights is definitely, at least in my opinion, a beautiful idea. No, but the same standards are applied to persons that are very different with each other. When I start a class on human rights, either in my university in Italy or in American university, when it happens that I have the opportunity to teach there, I always start with a question to my students. Why are human rights important? Which may appear a very basic question, but I always receive different answers. And in most cases, students are unprepared to this kind of question, because on the one hand, I repeat, it is very basic, but on the other hand, it's something that you don't think that can be asked by a professor, no? My purpose is to reach the point that, well, human rights are essential in our life in order to live the life that we desire. So if you want to use a single word, human rights are essential for the happiness of a person. But then you realize that the recipe for happiness is not the same for everybody in the world. On the contrary, people living in a given area sometimes have needs that are opposite to persons living in a different area of the world. So if you apply and interpret human rights through using pre-established criteria that you think are valid for everybody. In many cases, this would lead to the fact that human rights will result effective only for part of the people living in the world. And this has much to do with the idea of reparations that I have tried to develop. No? As you know, in the world, there are many different human rights monitoring bodies, and they share some elements in their approach, but that they also have their specific peculiarities. So, for instance, when it comes to the European system, in most cases, it is considered that compensation is a form of reparation that is capable to repair any kind of damage suffered by a person. This does not hold true for indigenous peoples, exactly for the spiritual conception of life, no? So, for instance, that just to give you an example, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has been able to transform the contents of the right to property from a Western conception to a concept that is capable of realizing the expectations of indigenous communities. So the idea of the right to property as an individual rights according to the European model has been turned into a right to keep possession of the traditional lands of indigenous communities, a possession which is collective, belongs to the community, and a possession which is based on spiritual elements. So the land is the mother, the community belongs to the land cannot be sold for money because you cannot sell your mother or divide her into parts, no, in exchange of money. And culturalization means that human rights standards, to the extent possible, must be adapted to the real needs of people in order to make them effective. Otherwise, they would exist on paper, but they would not keep their promise for the people in the real life.
So I'm glad you brought this up because that was going to be the last part of our conversation, which is about reparations and asking you to define reparations. But what I'm hearing you say is that it really depends on your perspective.
Yes, it depends on the perspective of the victim of the wrong, basically.
And what you're saying also, and this, a good example of this occurred, which is why we met in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where the government actually acknowledged the rights for reparations. And maybe you could just share a little bit of your participation in that and what you experienced.
Of course, it's a pleasure for me. Reparations have a not totally, but for a big part, they have a different meaning for the different communities living in the world. For indigenous peoples, reparations must have the purpose to heal the damage, the wrong suffered, not only in materials, but especially in spiritual terms. This is the reason why, when it comes to reparations for indigenous peoples, the way that has proven to be effective is to combine several different ways, several different methods of providing reparation. So, on the one hand, also for indigenous peoples, there is the need to repair the material damage they have suffered. But on the other hand, the main purpose of reparation is to reestablish the correct relations indigenous peoples have with the environment, with the world in general, with their ancestors, with the spirits. So, for instance, there is a judgment of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights concerning the Moiwana community in Suriname. The Moiwana community is part of the Nduka people. And basically, it was a case in which the army of the state of Suriname perpetrated a massacre in the village of an indigenous community, killing many people. And the aspect that was most detrimental for the surviving members of the community was not the material damage they had suffered, but the fact that they were not able to practice their burial traditions as regards the dead members of the society, because the bodies had been removed by the army of Suriname. And it was very interesting because the Inter-American Court of Human Rights recognized that for the surviving member of the community, the fact of not having the possibility to practice their burial traditions gave rise to spiritual illnesses that in turn translated into physical illnesses, which were transmitted from generation to generation until the wrong would have not been properly repaired. So the only way for the community to reestablish their relationship with life and with the world in general, especially the spiritual world, was to have the bodies of the dead members back and to practice their traditions in terms of burial. There was no other way. I mean, it is something that in Europe probably many people would define superstition, no? Okay, you think that if you don't properly bury that particular person, she will come back to you as a ghost every night or something like that. Again, it's something that we don't believe that is possible, or most people in Europe that do not believe that is possible. But for indigenous peoples, on the contrary, is an essential part of their life. So it's much more important than money, than any material thing.
Right.
Because it is the spiritual element which must be redressed, basically.
Right. And much more. Yeah, much broader definition of reparations.
But the definition is not so easy to give a definition. I mean, reparations is redress, which is capable to repair the wrong suffered by a given community according to the perspective of the community itself and its members. This is the reason why the members of a community should be the main actors in the definition of the measures of reparations to be applied.
In the last few minutes that we have in our conversation, Federico, can you share what happened in St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
Of course. You mean during the conference and after the conference?
Yeah, and how reparations were handled, or an aspect of that, with Baliso.
Yes, Baliso was definitely a really special moment. Of course, the activity, the movement for reparations of the Garifuna people is ongoing at present, or I would say it is just at its beginning. But we have already established some interesting points, especially the fact that we should be able to identify all the Garifuna people who presently are spread in different countries, Central America, but as you know much better than me, in the United States as well. No. and then we should hear from their experience. We should establish what they really need. We should define the wrongs that they have suffered. And one very important point that must be valued, probably more than any other, is exactly the intergenerational character of the wrong suffered by indigenous peoples. Because in legal terms, otherwise, when it comes to a claim for reparation, because you have been victim of a wrong at a given time, normally the principle of intertemporal law applies, which means that if at the time the wrong took place, that kind of behavior was not prohibited by law, you're not entitled to any kind of reparation because you are not a victim of a wrong at the relevant time, even though today that particular behavior is considered a wrong. But as you know, law evolves, no? And this is normally the principle which applies to the majority of situations around the world. But it does not apply for indigenous peoples because the negative effects of the wrong they suffer even a couple of centuries ago continue to be perceived by the generations living today. So this is the reason why they are entitled to reparation, because the wrong they have suffered is an ongoing wrong, which does not exhaust its effects to a given historical time. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, there are interesting decisions of international bodies recognizing right of indigenous communities to receive reparations for wrongs received 50 years ago, for instance, even though at the time there was no obligation for states to recognize them any kind of right, exactly for these intergenerational effects of the wrong. And this is the point, of course, on which we try to the point that we try to use in order to promote the right of the Garifuna people to reparations. Mm-hmm. But reparations sometimes, and now we come to the wonderful experience we had in Baliso. Reparations sometimes it is also self-reparation, to the extent that the community is given the possibility to reestablish its relations with the past generations and with the spiritual whole that characterizes the existence of the community itself. So for the Garifuna people, I think having the possibility to go to Baliso and to remember what happened there, because you know very well that for indigenous communities, memory is essential, no? Keep memory of what happened to past generations. And it is already a form of reparation, no? The right that we had with the shells and then on the top of the hill, it is something very meaningful because it gives the opportunity to the community to recover something that was deprived to them in the past.
Right. And for the audience that is not aware, Baliso was an island off of St. Vincent where the Garifuna people were exiled to, and many of them perished before they were then further exiled to Roatan off of Honduras. And so it has a lot of very spiritual meaning to them because of what took place on Baliso Island.
Yes, and going there, especially, I mean, for people who are not members of the community, is a really strong experience, I would say, no? Not only, personally, I felt honored to have that opportunity, but it is not easy to manage a day in Baliso, also for the reason that, as you know, you can still find the bones of many of the members of the Garifuna who perished there. So it is something really touching. And I can imagine that since it is very difficult to approach a situation of that kind, for most people, the best solution would be to forget what happened, no? And to start again life from now. But this is something that does not work for indigenous communities.
Right.
On the contrary, the link with the past is essential for the spiritual life.
Well, I really appreciate having this opportunity to have this conversation with you, Federico. You bring some very important perspective to the conversation. So I want to thank you very much. And we really have just touched the surface, and hopefully we'll have another opportunity to continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Stefan. Really, many thanks for the opportunity you gave me.
You're welcome. And it's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
All right. So